You know, those emails that we read at the intro segment where they pointed out that they heard about things that they never would have heard about had we not talked about it on the show. And it sort of occurred to us, or occurred to me anyway, that a lot of those titles that we talk about are things that are actually really famous, but fame is relative. Case in point, even in anime, like especially in anime, I would say fame is relative because it was just in the news, like as we record this a few days ago, that there is going to be yet another attempt by Toei Animation to do a live action version of one of their anime properties. And I never take stock in much of these things until they actually start filming. But it was in the Hollywood Reporter that they said, we are definitely going forward with the threats that we made back in 2017. And it's been 4 or 5 years now. We're going to make a live action Saint Seiya. Or, you know, live Knights of the Zodiac. And it's going to have Sean Bean and Famke Janssen as, you know, Athena or whatever. And Sonny Chiba's son, like whatever kind of stuff like that. And everyone's like, okay, yeah. But it's real. We filmed it. It's done. We're doing the effects work. A lot of the social media response immediately, like one of the most common ones is, why isn't everybody in this from Brazil? Why isn't the movie in Portuguese or whatever? And the reason is because Saint Seiya in Brazil is like the biggest thing ever. It was like, and there was actually just an article on Anime News Network all about this formative aspect that Saint Seiya was over there. You know, he actually mentioned that the Comic-Con over there is actually the biggest Comic-Con in the world. Bigger than SDCC, bigger than the one in France, and et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, I thought Comic-Con was. I guess this one got larger.
I guess Comic-Con Experience, or CCXP, and it only started in 2014. That's the biggest geek convention in the world in terms of everything, but it's basically like, you know, what you'd expect a SDCC to be as opposed to like a Comic-Con. Maybe you didn't count Comic-Con in that. Point is that what I didn't know, I always knew Saint Seiya was huge in Brazil, especially, and South America and stuff like that. But what I didn't know is that it didn't actually start showing up there until 1994. I actually thought that the reason these shows caught on in other countries and stuff was because they got it at the same time or roughly around when it came out. But it actually came out there around the similar time, like kind of like a year before we got Sailor Moon here. And Sailor Moon is a big deal here, but it took a couple of years. And certainly Saint Seiya started in the 80s. And so it was like a good 7 years or whatever before they actually got it. And it became a super huge thing.
Especially in Canada.
I bring this up because as we do this podcast, there continues to be more and more things that you find out about that were really popular in other parts of the world that no one here has ever heard about. Because Saint Seiya, try as they might, nobody in the United States cares about Saint Seiya. And we always said, like, well, it's because it never got released when it was contemporary, right? And the reasons that it did get were bad. Those are also true. But even when they go back and they start to do like, here's the re-release of it. Now it's unaltered and readily available streaming on Netflix and Crunchyroll. You don't even have to buy it. You just ought to watch. They usually die on the vine. Yet Masami Kurumada is one of the most influential manga creators of all time. One of the foundational bedrock creators of what we consider shonen action adventure, which is by far the most popular genre of anime there is.
There's especially a lot of those like 70s and 80s things like that, like Ashita no Joe, that were huge in Japan and maybe other places, never here.
Yeah, Captain Tsubasa is another great example. Huge all around the world, but not here. What I'm going to talk about is another one of those titles that the more you read about it, the more you realize, wow, this thing kind of was a big deal, but nobody here really has like any sort of nostalgia or built-in knowledge for it. Name of this series is called Haikara-san ga Tooru. The international title, as it's been translated, is Here Comes Miss Modern. This is a shojo anime, shojo manga, I should say, from the 1970s, 1975, by a lady named Waki Yamato, who most people probably have either never heard of or they know her for one thing that's started to become released by Kodansha digitally very recently. And that is her release of, like, she did a manga adaptation of The Tale of Genji, which is one of the oldest works of Japanese literature, you know, from like the 11th century. And she's got like this version of it called Dreams at Dawn in 10 volumes. And it's all out by Kodansha in English fairly recently.
I think a couple of those got put out some time ago in those bilingual editions. I think I have a couple of them. But yeah, that's cool that they finally put it out like in English, like fully.
Yeah. And so the thing about Haikara-san, which I'll talk about in more detail in a bit, but as some background, it started in 1975 and it was the inaugural winner of the Kodansha Manga Award. It was a tie, though. It was tied with one other thing in the shoujo category. And the thing it was tied with was Candy Candy. Just for reference, the shonen category.
Another series that was really popular.
Massively popular.
All kinds of other places.
Else.
All over the world, yeah.
Not
Over here, it's like a trivia note to Dave Merrill. Like, you know, he's the Candy Candy guy. The Kodansha Manga Award is generally a very difficult thing to win. For reference, the inaugural winner in the shonen category was Blackjack by Osamu Tezuka. And it was tied with another title, The Three-Eyed One, also by Osamu Tezuka.
Damn it, Tezuka.
When you look at like the winners of the Kodansha Manga Award, it's a lot of heavy hitters, a lot of real great works, you know, including Prison School, also a winner of the Kodansha Manga Awards. So really just the top tier of things. But the thing is, you don't really hear a whole lot about shoujo manga, especially the formative works in the United States. We know more now about, say, the Showa 24 group, because Ryoko Ikeda's The Rose of Versailles only finally just got released here in English. People have known out here. We know about Keiko Takemiya because some things got released way back when from Vertical, and for whatever reason, people have not touched Keiko Takemiya since. And I always make it up because Moto Hagio hates her, but I don't know how true that actually is. But there are other really formative groups besides the Showa 24 group. For example, Waki Yamato, she was an associate of Yumiko Igarashi, who's the artist for Candy Candy, as well as another woman named Yoko Tadatsu. And I'm not going to lie, I've never read any of her work because I don't think a single one of it has been localized into English, officially or otherwise.
Doesn't sound familiar, no.
Yeah, very few of those 70s series have come out, and most of them only came out recently.
And the three of them also revolutionized shoujo manga, just not quite in the same way as the Showa 24 group, aka the 49ers, weren't even all born in 1949 or Showa 24. But the point is that too was a big revolution in shoujo, but they were not the same way. Like Candy Candy, more like a romance story in that sense, more like what people would think of as traditional. And so people here, we never read it and we don't know anything about it, but it is one of the most enduring things in the Kodansha catalog, and even the Nippon Animation catalog, because in 1978, they made a TV series adaptation of the shoujo manga, and let's just say, to be diplomatic, Nippon Animation probably spent the majority of their efforts animating Future Boy Conan that same year instead. By and large, the TV adaptation of Haikara-san was a lot of stills, and a lot of it was still images taken directly from the manga, just like put on there, done pretty economically, and actually got canceled after 42 episodes before they could fully finish the story. But much like things like Mobile Suit Gundam, much like things like Lupin the Third, which were cut short early, but got reran several times over the years, developed an enduring following that remains to this day. I checked the original manga, Haikara-san, it's still in print right now. In 2006, around when the Anime World Order podcast, when we did episode 1, the television station TV Asahi, they put out a list. The 100 favorite anime in Japan. Haikara-san made the list. It was 71st place out of 100. That puts it above Rama 1/2. That puts it above Devilman, Mazinger Z, Bleach, Crayon Shinchan, Nana, and Saint Seiya, which we just got done talking about. So it is this thing that is, when people are nostalgic for like that 70s shoujo stuff, it's not just the Rose of Versailles, and it's not just the ones we've heard about. This is something that people remember, not just in Japan, but also all over the world, because it got released freaking everywhere. This thing came out in France. It came out in Italy.
È stata dura, ma ne valeva proprio la pena.
L'ho messo soltanto perché mi ci ha costretto lei.
Shinobu, il suo giovane sposo, verrà presto dato per dispezzo.
It came out in Russia. It came out in Arabic.
حبيبة الجميع هاي 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 بحكاياها ياي 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 يفرح الجميع.
But it did not come out in the United States. And so it's interesting because when you look, it's like they've made all these adaptations of it. There was a live action movie. You can probably guess how good that is. Multiple Takarazuka Review stage play musicals, the famous all-female musical troupe, which, of course, Rosa Versailles was a lot of its mania too, or maybe vice versa. But the most recent adaptation of Haikara-san was 2020. Why did it stop? COVID stopped it. So, this is a thing that's been around and it's been known, and nobody in the United States knows anything about it. Like, it's like the first time anyone is hearing about a lot of this stuff. And so that sort of brings me to what we're going to review today, is the theatrical film remake that's fairly recent by comparison. It came out in 2017. It's 2 parts. It was released in the US by a company called 11 Arts. We've talked about them before. It seems like they've got some sort of deal where if Warner Brothers Japan releases the movie, then they get to release the movie here. Kind of a small company. And this movie did not help because they were like, we cannot under any circumstances market this movie as a modernization of a shojo thing from the 70s that nobody has seen. So they hid that, and it was a colossal bomb. And so they never released the second part on video. But we're reviewing it because you can actually watch it on streaming now. What's it about? This is where we have to do like the cybernetic ghost of Christmas Past from the future. Thousands of years ago kind of background, but because it's relevant to the premise of the series, what I'm going to do for the background of this, I will frame it in terms of the only way that any of us know anything about Japanese history, and that's video games and other anime set in the time. So Haikara-san is a period piece set in Japan in the turn of the century. Taisho era. But I can't really explain what is the Taisho era before explaining what the previous eras were. So in the mid-1400s to the early 1600s, there was the Age of the Warring States. That's the Sengoku era, which is where like the anime Sengoku Basara, that's about that time. In that era, to keep things very oversimplified, the emperor lost their power. The person actually in charge of things was what's known as the shogun. You've all heard the word, but the shogun is the head of the military. They're appointed by the emperor, but they effectively are the ones who call the shots. The position of shogun is hereditary, the way a king basically is. So that warring states period, that lasts like 200 years, like it ends in the 1600s, when this guy named Tokugawa becomes the shogun. You've probably heard that name at some place somewhere before. The Tokugawa shogunates, where, again, it's passed down from successor to successor, that lasts for 200 years till the mid-1800s. That's when the Tokugawa shogunate ends, when Commodore Perry from the United States shows up in his black warships that are way more powerful and technically advanced than anything Japan's got.
And the country's been closed off to most foreigners for some time.
250 years or so. Japan's been isolated from the rest of the world, and now the foreigners show up and say, you're opening up Japan to trade. Everybody wants a piece. China wants a piece. Germany wants a piece. You name it. There are forces within Japan that are concerned about all these foreigners coming in and maybe trying to carve out Japan for themselves.
Right.
Very rapid modernization.
Yeah, and there was a lot of anxiety. Well, yeah, too. And especially, like, China had just suffered a lot of bullshit from Western imperialism. And so there was a lot of stuff going on. Some of this was a little bit after all of the initial conflict got taken care of. But there was a very concerted effort that basically Japan was like, we do not want to be in the same place as China. We don't want to get overrun. So we want to figure out a way to position ourselves as equal or relatively equal.
And so a group of revolutionaries And the name of these revolutionaries was called the Ishin Shishi. They start advocating we need to restore the emperor to power. And a civil war coup breaks out between the faction loyal to restoring the empire and the faction loyal to the shogun.
If you've seen Rurouni
Yes,
Kenshin.
that is what Rurouni Kenshin is
Yeah.
about. This period is called the Bakumatsu because the imperialists won. Tokugawa shogunate's overthrown. So the reason it's called Bakumatsu, that basically, if you translate it, more or less means the end of the shogunate.
Anything with the Shinsengumi, really.
So that is the last years of the Tokugawa period. They restore the emperor to power, and that's what's called the beginning of the Meiji era.
Restoration.
The Meiji Restoration. Yeah. The problem sort of with that was they didn't all fully agree on what they wanted to do after restoring the emperor. And so there ended up being a big, massive, rapid influx of foreign technologies, foreign ideas, things like that.
The country basically had to modernize on fast forward.
Like speed run.
They had to try to industrialize and modernize as fast as possible. Again, because they wanted to position themselves as
we got to be on the level.
At least close to equal.
Yeah, like fascinatingly, like most Japanese people didn't have last names. They had to like come up with last names after that point. I remember hearing like a history lesson about that.
Yeah, I mean the nobility would have like family.
Right. The nobility
names,
would, and
but regular people,
didn't.
Yeah.
And so the Tokugawa era, not a lot changed for like 250 years. Then the Meiji era comes along, very short-lived by comparison, maybe about 40 years, and a whole bunch of stuff had to change. But then there was one really short era just after that, only about 15 years or so, and that's the Taisho era, 1912 to 1926. Now, despite lasting for a very brief period, that era is a very fascinating, tumultuous time in history because Japan was kind of at a crossroads of like, hey, we could go this way or we could go that way. And it isn't entirely sure what's going to happen at that time.
And there were some really big changes during that time, like the establishment of schools for women.
Schools for women.
Which is relevant to Haikara-san.
That's directly relevant. The establishment of a two-party political system. And so another common name you may hear for the Taisho era is the Taisho democracy. Japan, as a result of World War I happens, Japan's fighting Germany. They're seizing control of German territories out of China. Doesn't particularly thrill China, but it does make Japan a player on the international stage, like Clarissa was saying, and they're now able to cut deals with Russia. They say, okay, we're going to secure lands in Manchuria and Mongolia, which does not particularly thrill China. But then Russia has the Bolshevik Revolution, and so Japan starts making moves. They're going to occupy Siberia, and so Japan's not got money in the bank. They've got international clout. There's people from all over the world that are aware of Japan, coming to Japan, being fascinated by their culture. There's intermingling of ideas and culture in general. It started during the Meiji. It accelerated during the Taisho era. The industrialization, the modernization, the introduction of universal suffrage for men, the spread of foreign ideas, democracy, socialism, communism,
Western medicine,
Christianity. These all started to, like that, after having been violently suppressed for 250 years, because again, the Portuguese came in and the Dutch came in during the warring states, but it was illegal to be Christian and et cetera. All this stuff was purged for many years. But one of the things that made it also particularly interesting, especially for the realm of shojo, was not just the establishment of women's education, but what we might start to recognize today as modern women's rights issues. And so Taisho era, you kind of see it visited upon in fiction because Japan is right at the midst of like this traditionalist movement as well as a modernist movement, accepting those Western ideals as it pertains to fashion and science and religion. Before it was immediately suppressed and discouraged. And as it turns out, once the Showa era started right afterwards, it was violently suppressed and discouraged. Japan ended up going the strongly conservative route. But that's why the Taisho era, as short as it is a period you see in fiction fairly frequently, because there is this confluence of all these emerging modernity with feudal traditionalist tenets that make for some interesting conflicts in story. And so that is the time frame that this story takes place. Haikara-san ga Tooru, Here Comes Miss Modern. The general premise. I don't know how much of the story I really want to get into. I can sort of maybe say before that, the people who this series influenced. I think the most famous fan of Haikara-san, and I probably don't need to elaborate on who this person is, Naoko Takeuchi, the creator of Sailor Moon. This was maybe her second favorite series growing up as a kid. One of the quotes, I've got it right here, it's translated. She said, "When I was in kindergarten, I had 3 cousins, all sisters, who lived next door, who used to always show me their manga. I loved Aim for the Ace, Rose of Versailles, Haikara-san ga Tooru, Suna no Shiro, the Castle of Sand, and others. My cousin set the standard for what manga I got to read. One I really loved as a child was Candy Candy. I was entranced by that. Also cited as a particular favorite by Yuki Suetsugu. I don't know if you know the name, but you probably know the work that she made. She's the author of Chihaya Furu, also won the Kodansha Manga Award, as well as Nahoka Uehashi, just butchered that name, I'm sorry, but fantasy author, professor of ethnology. Probably don't know the name, but you probably know the work that she is best known for because she wrote Moribito, Guardian of the Spirit. All of these works sort of were influenced in some way by liking Haikara-san. It's interesting because a lot of what happens here is very, in some ways, dated if we were to watch it now, because this is something from nearly 50 years ago.
Yeah, the romantic tropes, I think it would be interesting to see how people react to it, because there's definitely a lot of, particular romantic tropes that are more old-fashioned.
Out of fashion now, because, again, this thing was, revolutionary for 40 years ago. And nowadays you'll say oh, this is maybe a little antiquated. And it just is. There's no way around it. But the premise is, it's the Taisho era, and there is a girl named Benio. And Benio is the daughter of a military colonel. She's of pretty high social standing. And so she has got to go to a private girls' school that is basically there to teach her how to be a suitable wife for the nobility.
皆さん、このアトム女学館は行儀作法、花嫁修行、その他諸々100番、女子として恥ずかしくない教養を身につけ、そして良き殿方に見出され、輝く日本国の母となるための学び屋です。
There is a phrase, good wives and wise mothers. I don't know if you've heard this phrase before, but it is sort of associated with traditional, conservative, East Asian conception of what a woman's role in society should be. And that role is you must be able to sew, you must be able to cook, you must be able to clean.
Right.
In order for you to do your patriotic duty, which is raise capable sons to do the actual work. Basically, it's a control mechanism that ran directly counter to the concepts of Western feminism ideals like women's suffrage, having formal education, sexual liberation, etc. So Benio is a terrible student when it comes to this sort of stuff because she is, we would consider a tomboy.
どうしました、花村さん。
はあ、ついうっかり忘れまして。
ついうっかり先週も先々週も先々先週も忘れましたわね。うっかり4回分まとめて廊下に立ってなさい。
Series, I believe it starts in 1918, Taisho year 7.
I do wonder if this series is the one that kickstarted the trend of the female main character who's terrible at cooking and that kind of stuff.
Could be. I mean, I think it might have been one of several. I don't think this was the one necessarily, but I'm not an expert. Basically, for context, World War I is right about to end in mid-1918. So, the war is kind of winding down. You don't really see too much effects of it at the home front. But because her mother passed away when she was very young, very common for, your shojo heroine, she's raised by a military man, her dad. And so he's very concerned about her becoming a proper Japanese Yamato Nadeshiko kind of wife. But she's doing kendo and dressing in clothing that is not very traditional, sucks at, can't make tea or do the housework, all that kind of stuff like that.
なんで私が？まあいいわ。私だって女らしいってところを見せてあげる。じゃあ筒は。
あ！それはいい。お茶のはこっちでございますよ。ああ。
And the series starts where she didn't make her kimono for summer assignment because she doesn't want to have an arranged marriage. She wants to get a job. Right. She wants to marry the person that she loves, which again,
both her and her friend Tamaki.
Yeah, well, Tamaki,
that's like their
is
thing.
Her like school air quotes rival best friend, and she is interested because she's started to read the Western literature on women's rights, and so she's also punished, even though she's smart, because she's too much of a damn radical. And so they both of them are resolved that, okay, we're going to embrace modernity in our lives as opposed to, go in this route. And of course, in the traditional shoujo fashion, it doesn't quite go as planned because Benio ends up being betrothed to someone who she's never met. Or rather, she meets them in the very Sailor Moon style, where you run into someone who treats you like an asshole. And then you fall, you find out that you're, this is the person who you're going to marry.
Certainly worse in the original anime.
Yeah. Again, he's like far, far more of a jerk in the original 70s version, which they toned that down a bit for this one here. But it turns out that there is a gentleman by the name of Shinobu Ijuin, who is a lieutenant in the army, and very much like Maria in Sakura Taisen, which is another series set during the Taisho era, and a lot of the same stuff kind of comes up there. Shinobu is your blonde-haired...
half German, I think they said.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. He's half German, so, you don't have to feel totally guilty that you've betrayed the Japanese race by falling in love with a foreigner. But that's always there. Like, Maria in Sakura Wars is, she is somehow half Japanese. You get that a lot, even to this day. Anytime there's like a harem show where there's like the blonde girl with big boobs, somehow she's half Japanese. Well, this time it's a guy who's the tall, blonde dreamboat Ken doll kind of guy. But he is a soldier and he is friends with Benio's father and says, okay, before you were born, Benio, the decision was made that you would be married to this guy. And the reason is because during the Bakumatsu, your grandparents, the families, you had star-crossed lovers. One family was in support of the imperialists and one side was in support of the shogun. And there was a forbidden romance and they vowed to each other that someday our families will be together, and it wasn't able to happen during the Bakumatsu. And
so now it's your job to...
then again, it's like the descendants, they were all girls or something like that for the next generation. So now it falls to you that you have to meet this pact that was made between my family and their family, for Benio Hanamura is her last name, and the Ijuin, clan. You guys have to be married for this. And so this is news to fucking her because no one ever told her this, and she's going to school and being told like, hey, you have to do this, and she's rejecting that, and she's like, okay, not happening.
Yeah. But of course, like, her desires aren't important because it's all
right,
family.
Because it's a traditionalist military family.
2代目に生まれたのが両家とも男でな。そこで3代目に引き継がれた。
それが私とあの少尉、生まれた時から決められていた縁だ。私、お断りします。そんな前時代からの約束、もう時効です。それによりによって。
The military, for those who maybe haven't been clear, is generally the most conservative of institutions there is. There's not a whole lot of talk about freedom and individuality and stuff like that when it comes to people who are from the military. All I've talked about takes place within the first, I would say, 10 minutes of the first movie. Because this is a Manga ran for about 2 or 3 years, about 8 volumes, and they're like, we are going to tell the whole thing across these 2 movies. Like I said, they made a 42-episode TV show where they did not finish telling the story. The scope of that 42 episodes was basically what happened in the first movie. So
yeah,
what effectively ends up happening is very similar.
Shit just goes full speed ahead
to the Yoshikazu Yasuhiko movie adaptation of a manga. Is things go at 1,000 miles an hour, and I think just because of the nature of what 1970s shoujo was, I actually think it fits. Because one of the criticisms I often have of, like, say the Venus Wars or Arion is like characters get introduced and you don't really know them, and then maybe they're killed or whatever, and then moving right along. But in this, it's like such a crazy energy of like this, like, it's a soap opera. It's Days of Our Lives. That's basically what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, because Benio is childhood friends with Ranmaru, who is a boy who looks like a girl because he's training to be a kabuki actor, but he's got to play the women's parts.
Who deserved better.
Yeah, of course,
so
just like Nozaki-kun is like the king of like the best friend character who deserves better but gets nothing, and it's only us the viewers who are like so sad for the person who gets screwed over. But in the span of this story, it's like, oh, of course that guy gets screwed over because whatever. But he loves Benio and hasn't been able to confess this all their lives, but she wants to choose somebody else, but she's engaged to somebody. But her best friend also loves Shinobu, but she has never told her about this. And so they decide, okay, we're going to run off and we're going to cancel out this marriage. And we get not very far because we run across this dude who's a gangster and a Yakuza kind of guy, but Benio beats his ass, and so he swears fealty to her in the Yakuza fashion or what have you.
まだやる気なら相手になるわよ。私今日は気が立ってるんだから。い
や、参った。牛五郎乾杯で。親分、おいらを子分にしておくんなさい。
And goes through with it.
Commits his life to it because this story takes place over years, as it turns out.
And for the first time, Benio gets absolutely smashed.
It's a recurring running gag that she is a terrible drunk because, again, she's like 17 years old, but, is just as part of that going through all this stuff.
Proceeds to have like the equivalent of the shonen super ultra plot armor. Just shoujo style.
Shoujo heroine plot armor that would typically be like extremely dangerous and life-threatening in the true candy sort of fashion. She's gonna stave this off or not really mind too much.
Shoujo plot armor, it's more like if someone actually would have done this, they would have sent her home and that would have been the end of it. But no, she gets chance after chance after chance after chance.
Well, look at who are.
薩摩公が御手ずからわしに可視された我が家宝10枚が1枚欠けてもわしの武士としての面目が立たぬわ女中お前一人知らせはせぬ手打ちの後わしもしらばらかしさばいてお詫びをする覚悟ベニオさん頑張るなんてことベニオなぜわしの皿を
Family is, Gerald. It's a colonel, damn it. This is a high-ranking military family, and we've got a vow that must be fulfilled for a generation. So if she's got plots to be like, okay, I am going to derail this arranged marriage. I am going to screw this up.
Shinobu's grandpa does kind of want to send her back.
Yeah, because he's the traditionalist, because he hates the family because they... were supporting the other side. And of course, he's married to, the woman who made the vow. And he's always resentful that, like, you must be pining away for this dude, but I'm the one who married you and, all this stuff like that. And so that ends up becoming a plot point. And so she's like, all right, well, I will sabotage the arranged marriage by being the shittiest possible bride to be imaginable. Try as she may, it backfires on her and doesn't really work out because Shinobu is like endeared by this the more and more she does. And he calls her from the beginning Haikara-san, which the subtitles translate that as Miss Modern. Haikara is just the way the Japanese would say high collar, which is in reference to the Western fashion sensibilities of the early 1900s.
Mm-hmm. And Shinobu says basically that he's kind of like part of what he wants is for her to come in and shake up
Right.
the family.
But he is
and change things.
simultaneously a guy who is a military man who's grown up in, nobility and, aristocracy and privilege. So he's got some degree of blind points to that because he's like, yeah, what do you mean? Of course you're going to marry me because we're told to. That goes without saying.
Seems to have very little concern for her feelings.
Well, it's,
really.
If you're a Japanese soldier in the 1900s, how much concern do you really have for your wife other than, you going to give me a child and, keep the house in order? But
at least he actually likes her.
There has to be a believable limit because you can't fully be the modern man as far as that, because then there's no conflict of the series. And yet, very much like what ends up sort of happening in like a Ranma 1/2 sort of scenario where these two people are put together because of things their parents did, the hope being that they end up falling for one another. Benio ends up falling gradually for Shinobu. Seems a little rapid of a development in the movie. Maybe part of that is just by virtue of the fact that you're compressing so much into such a little amount of time, but it's a whole bunch of just outrageous things happening. A lot of it is generally very silly in tone, relatively lighthearted. There's a lot of sight gags and stuff like that. You can tell there's a lot of characters from the manga who they didn't really get to put in the movie and give full attention to, because whenever there's like crowd shots, like you see a lot of unique like designs of like sort of like goofy Tezuka sort of gag characters. Like there's one who's like, he's a kid, but he's wasted the whole time. That's the
Constantly,
joke.
Yeah, every shot.
But,
never says a thing.
Never says a word in this, but he's just like, smashed out of his mind. Kind of like how Tezuka has like the little pig gourd kind of things or whatever in the corner. And then, it would not be 70s shojo, especially in the time of Candy Candy, if not some like sweeping melodramatic shifts going back and forth, because it does in fact turn out that the fact that Shinobu is half German does come into play, that there is a racial resentment towards him for being a lieutenant, because Benio's antics get her in the crosshairs of, some military men who are like, okay, well, I'm going to retaliate. I'm going to send this fucker to the front lines over in Siberia, even though the war is basically almost over. And so that's what happens. Basically, so far, everything we've said, hasn't really said like what's actually going to happen in this film. But I will say, if you want some further things to convince yourself, the director of this is a guy who I tend to like quite a bit. His name is Kazuhiro Furuhashi, who is a person who is very, very experienced with doing these period piece things, because he is the director of Rurouni Kenshin. He is also the director of something that I'm surprised hasn't been rediscovered by people. We reviewed this like decades ago, but it was called Le Chevalier d'Eon. That was also a period piece, but it was in France. And I feel like at some point people are going to rediscover that, because it's like such a trans narrative, because Dan de Beaumont was a real person who lived a life in that sort of way. And in the way the TV series depicts it is it transforms from a man into a woman. So I feel like at some point people are going to find that show and get a renewed interest in it. But Furuhashi did that. Furuhashi also directed Gundam Unicorn. So, I mean, this guy is generally doesn't miss as far as the things that he's made directorial wise. Let me see what else he's done that people may know about. Ah, yes. The greatest achievement of Kazuhiro Furuhashi. No, not You're Under Arrest, the OAVs and TVs, though he did do that. No, not Sepang, though he did do that. I'm talking about the ultimate feather in Furuhashi's cap. He is the director, yes, of Neo Yokio. That's right. You don't deserve the giant Toblerone. They got him somehow.
Knock, knock. It's me, Kaz. I brought you a big Toblerone.
To do that one, let's listen. The guy does good work. He's not a miracle worker to that extent, but he did do the second Fatal Fury OAV, and it wasn't entirely Obari who worked on that. So again, generally speaking, really good stuff, even though maybe I personally am not the biggest fan of, say, something like Get Backers. But if any of that is interesting to you, this movie can be bought. The first part is on Blu-ray. It got dubbed and subbed. It was released through Right Stuff, actually. And it is on streaming. Both parts are free to watch on Tubi TV. That's TUBI.TV. It's also on Amazon Prime, though Amazon being Amazon, if you want to watch on Prime, which is much more widely known a platform compared to Tubi. You now must pay for renting part 1, whereas part 2 is free. And the thing about part 2 is 11 Arts traditionally release things in the theater. They released this in the theater, part 1, and it was the biggest bomb they've ever had, and I feel like they almost went out of business because of how much money they lost.
I don't remember hearing of it coming out.
Well, that's just it. We went to Otakon one year, and all you would remember from that Otakon was the constant, nonstop advertisement of the Dragon Ball movie. Yeah. Vegeta versus Broly, Goku versus Broly. And like that trailer would play nonstop. But then in between that, there were other trailers. And one of them was for Haikara-san, Here Comes Miss Modern, which actually had a screening at the convention, which not a lot of people went to, because what the fuck is Haikara-san, Here Comes Miss Modern? Nobody here knows. And so the second movie never to this day came out on Blu-ray. Only within the last few months did they put it up on streaming on Amazon Prime, and that is free. But who's going to watch it if you haven't seen part 1? It's a rough deal. My recommendation is try to check this thing out now. Even if it sounds like potentially interesting, even if you don't like it, there's going to be a chance it's going to be gone. And there's going to be no Blu-ray and no other streaming platform. Or maybe it's going to be pay only. There's no way for me to know. But yeah, 11 Arts since then, they're like, okay, we haven't really released a whole lot. They lucked out because I guess they did work on like one of the Boruto movies and this Gintama movie. It's about to come out, but Gintama is not super popular in the United States compared to Japan. It's a thing. People are aware of the existence, but it's not like this cornerstone staple of Shonen Jump the way it is in other parts of the world.
And it's marketed as like the final movie, which I feel like is significant if you're really into Gintama, but otherwise it's like I've watched like 5 episodes of Gintama. And so
it's a comedy, so it's like the fact that the previous one was called Gintama the Final Chapter, and now it's Gintama the Final. Okay, it's kind of silly, but do what you can to see this. You may want to stop listening now, because at this point we're probably just going to spoil the stuff and talk about what we thought was okay and what we thought was not so great. Spoiler flag warning. This is kind of like the end of the first movie, and there's a whole second movie, but Shinobu gets sent off to the war and dies. Apparently, because they put him in a shitty formation spot and the war conflict breaks out and his body is never recovered. Now, Benio is finding herself in this position where it's like, okay, this was the guy I was arranged to be wed to, and I was against it first, but eventually I sort of fell for him, and I said, like, okay, tell you my feelings and we'll be married and stuff like that once you return, and now he's not coming back. And so she resolves, like, okay, even though I'm, the modern person, I am going to be a widow for basically the rest of my days, I suppose.
Even though she didn't actually marry him.
Well, no, she was engaged to marry him, right? It was like an arrangement, but it didn't actually go through.
It never occurred.
But she said, okay, I'll honor that and be single. Of course, being a single woman in 1920s Japan is maybe not the greatest situation, but now she is the head of the household because Shinobu is gone and she has to make the finances work. And hey, turns out no one was really paying attention to the books. And so now she's got to get a job. What jobs are there for a girl who can't cook or clean or sew or what have you? Well, she ends up becoming a newspaper reporter. This introduces a whole new cast of characters because there is a shabby, publisher, which for legal purposes is called Jodansha.
Jodansha.
Just to make it clear what the original publisher of this was, I'm pretty sure this is actually, much like Blue Blazes was a documentary, I think this is actually true of how the real Kodansha came about. Ignore the history that it didn't actually form until the 50s. I'm sure the real secret history is the true Kodansha started as a newspaper in the Taisho era. Interestingly enough, her first gig is to cover something that actually happened. There were rice riots of like supplies, and this is like a very sort of leftist narrative right off the bat, because the situation is the war is going on and their air quotes needs to ration rice. And so there's rice in a storeroom, but the people are starving. And the rice is not going out to any of the soldiers because the soldiers have been deployed or whatever. But the orders are orders that the rice must stay under lockdown while people starve. And so what happens, of course, the housewives get, fucking pitchforks and farming utensils and stuff and start a riot. over this. And so what does Benio do? She busts in the place and, you know, throws open the gates.
I love it.
明日子供たちに食べさせる分さえ手に入らないんだよ。
見てらんない。私がやってやる。中から破るのよ。力自慢の人、ついてきて。
The editor of the newspaper, if you didn't know, like they tried so hard to conceal that this was a reboot of a 1970s shoujo thing because all the character designs
there's two characters that just
have been
obvious.
redone, except for this editor. Like the second this dude shows up on camera, you're like, oh.
ごめんください。
借金取りなら来ても無駄だぞ。
吉次さんの紹介で雇っていただけたらと。
就職希望者だと貴様女だろうが。
女だって仕事はできますよ。
あいに行くと俺は男尊女卑なんでね。
This was something from the 70s that they're remaking.
Yes.
Because he is like the most like Lady Oscar looking dude you've ever seen in your life, with like the long blonde hair and like the willowy frame and the cravat, Miles Edgeworth style. And then the first thing he's like is, by the way, I despise all women, and all bodily contact with women causes me to break out in hives. Now get working.
一応採用だ。俺の名は青江統制。よろしく頼む。
嬉しい。本当に出るんだ。ごめんなさい。
Very 70s shoujo. Like the second you see this guy, it's like, okay, this guy is a true shoujo romantic lead of the 70s. Is a guy like this.
Yes.
And then similarly, like once Shinobu gets sent to the front, he doesn't have respect of the troops over there. And so the rowdy ringleader of them, the second you see this guy, you're like, oh, look at this Joe Yabaki, you know, looking, you know.
Yes.
並べと言っている。聞こえないのか。
小隊長殿、俺たちは実戦でみんな耳をやられてまして、もっと大きな声で呼んでください。
That was, I think, what I said. I was like, look at this 70s ass looking motherfucker. It's like,
who, like, you know, of course, you know, they bond in that traditional, definitely not gay way of beating the shit out of one another. And so, you know, as it turns out, the reason that Shinobu didn't make it back home is because he had to save the life of his friend, who comes back and feels guilty about this. And eventually the supporting characters all start interacting with one another, and
he starts to start a bandit troop.
Yeah, that's the other thing, because rumors abound that, hey, an ex-soldier of high rank who used to be in the Japanese army is actually still alive and is a bandit over in Manchuria. And so she's like, all right, well, I'm quitting my job as a newspaper reporter because I think it could be my fiance, Shinobu Ijuin. Of course, the editor's like, you're not fired. You're going over there and you're going to get me a story.
Chief's great.
Yeah. You know, this he's very like handsome J. Jonah Jameson.
Yes.
No Hitler stash or, you know, haircut you can land a plane on. And so the first movie ends where it's revealed that actually Shinobu is alive and has a wife who is from Russia, apparently, because, you know, in Siberia, there he is. And you're wondering, is it him or is it someone who looks exactly like him? And the answer is all of the above, because they've done they've done the full-on soap opera Amnesia.
Yes. The romance novel,
identical twin.
She just said, you know what? These two tropes, not dramatic enough. I'm just going to sandwich them together.
Right. Yeah. You know, thought to be dead, but you are found by the wife of your half-brother who you never knew, who died, who is identical looking to you in every way and has the same voice.
Was he actually the half-brother, or was that just something that they thought was the case? I wasn't clear on that.
I believe it actually was the case. That you just happened to be recovered. Your body, you fell off a cliff from mortar shrapnel 100 feet, you know, but maybe you landed in a bunch of trees and were sickly, and, you know, this woman who finds you, and God has blessed her by restoring to her dead husband, but she has got the most elegant of shoujo illnesses. She's got cholera. She's got consumption, which is the most beautiful shoujo death you can have. And so she nurses him back to health, and he doesn't fully remember who he is. And she starts saying, you know, I'll just start calling you my dead husband and you will believe that you are actually from Russia. And no one over there can say, actually, this guy looks half Japanese. No, because there's nothing Japanese looking about this half German guy anyway. And so they end up in the very like Kaoru Shintani, who incidentally his wife just passed away, but like very melodramatic style. Benio, who has cut her hair and looks totally different. They pass by one another at the train station, and you know there's a moment of uncertainty of was that him? Was that the man who I'm looking to see? No, couldn't be. And then they go their separate ways. That's the end of the first movie. If you saw this movie back in 2017, 2018, you didn't get to see part 2 until like a couple of months ago because 11 Arts, you know, they took such a bath on this thing. So anyway, the second movie starts. But again, this thing is moving at like 100 miles an hour. So it's like, I went to Manchuria. It's not you. It's your friend. I'm right back in Japan. And that took like, 5-10 minutes. You thought right. Like the way the first movie ended, it's like, okay, she's going to spend some time having to track this thing down and work this thing out. No, we don't have time for these things to keep things moving along. Now, suddenly it's luckily that she lives in Tokyo. But like the point is that airship dirigible arrives, which contains a Russian count or duke, I should say, and his wife, which is Shinobu and his new wife.
Right.
He has amnesia, which, they've got to restore his memory because he's like at first denying that it's him. And in fact, the 70s anime where it ended was right around here, the TV show. And they had to, even though the whole manga, I should say, was done, they had to quickly write an ending. And so the ending was that, okay, she is told it's not actually him, it's his brother, but then maybe not. Like, there's some little thing that they had to do just to wrap up that 70s
that
show.
Sounds like a rough place to have to end it.
Again.
Yeah.
That's the way that shoujo was that way. It's just like never like the full priority. And you got Hayao Miyazaki making his only television directed series ever, which is finally coming out in the United States, by the way. G-Kids, as a result of releasing the Ghibli films, ended up getting enough goodwill and faith that they were able to get everyone in a room and sign over the estate of Alexander Key and get Miyazaki and be like, okay, we are getting Future Boy Conan on Blu-ray with a dub. With
a dub, no less. Good
in
Lord.
A month or two. Again, G-Kids made their money because they sold to the upper 1% of hey, this is the children's animation that's sophisticated. And that's why, you get Matt Damon and all these people in their dubs is because they're the people whose kids they're sending to private schools that they then G-Kids would do their little festivals towards people like that. And so people are like, okay, I got to get in on these Miyazaki things. And so now, Future Boy Conan, who knows who's going to be in the dub of that? I don't know if there's going to be big heavy hitters. Maybe not because it's a full TV show. But all the effort went to that rather than animating Haikara-san at roughly the same time in 1978. So in the second movie, most of it is about wondering, okay, do I reconnect with Shinobu? He's moved on. He's got another wife that he took. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here with my vow of chastity for lifelong. And here's this motherfucker who's, got another woman now. As it turns out, my editor no longer breaks into hives when he comes in physical contact with just me. And oh, surprise, surprise, he's also the scion of a bank rebelling from his family because he hasn't succeeded the family business. So she's like, okay, well, do I go with this guy or do I, go with the chief? Well, Benio, one thing about her as a thoroughly modern, lady, the pacing of this film suggests that she changes her mind based on whoever talked to her last. Very much like, I don't know, Donald Trump or whatever.
It feels, because of that, it feels like her decisions are very abruptly taking a U-turn.
Right, but in reality...
Which I think is probably not the case in the manga.
When you look at the timeline of events, this whole story takes place over a good 5 years.
Yeah.
But there's montages where it's and suddenly 2 years must have passed because it's a lot of stuff in the manga was her working at the paper and getting to know these people or, gradually having something develop with the chief or what have you. Again, it's only 8 volumes, air quotes, only 8 volumes. But I mean, still, there's a logical amount of time that would have passed if you look at the series of events that they say okay, historically, this is when this happened. And historically, this is okay, it's been some time. But to us, it's been 20 minutes. And so it seems like it's insane.
Yes.
I mean, it's still insane. Don't get me wrong. That, I think, is sort of the resolving issue with this. It all comes down to, ultimately, she's like, all right, I will marry the chief. We will set the wedding, for 2 months from now. At this point, it's a dramatic irony, but obviously neither Gerald nor Clarissa nor anyone here in the United States is going to know it's a dramatic irony, because they set the wedding date for September 1st, 1923, and we're going to do it at lunchtime. Well, she has the Japanese-style wedding with Shinobu at first, or she was going to, because she's got like the kimono and stuff like that. And she's going to have the Christian wedding with the chief. And because it's a noon wedding in church, and they're about to exchange the rings, exchange the vows, and then right then and there, that's when the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 occurs, because it happened at 11:58 on September 1st, 1923, for 10 minutes. It caused an extensive firestorm, destroyed like a huge portion of the city. It was like a 8.0 or 7.9 or something like that. You've seen the Kanto quake mentioned in things like Violence Jack and Bubblegum Crisis and stuff, where there was like another quake or something like that, because it was just like this huge disaster. But of course, that's the climax of this story, where everything kind of comes to a head, where they're in the church, and now the church is in an earthquake, and people are trapped in there, and people got to get saved. This is the only part where it's like there's not a huge span of time, because Shinobu, who's got his wife who's ailing and dying of consumption, she gives her big, beloved, beautiful shoujo death, and on her deathbed, she's like, I was lying to you the whole time, or whatever it is like that, and I knew you weren't this, and you should go and be with her. And Shinobu is like, okay, see ya, and then zips off, and that's all it takes for him. And then Benio, who 4 to 10 minutes ago was in a wedding dress to marry the chief, nearly dies and seemingly is dead and killed. And then in a funny moment, it's revealed she's alive, and she exclaims, breaking the fourth wall.
Yes.
And then in so doing, she's like, as my life was flashing before me, my final thoughts were not of you, Chief. They were of Shinobu, the guy I thought I'd moved on. I couldn't quit him at all. And then he comes striding in on his horse and saves her, and then needs saving. And the chief saves both of them. And then they punch each other in the face once. And then he's like, I concede that you are the better man, Shinobu, and I'll go and inherit this bank. And Ranmaru, who's perennially screwed over, he apparently became like the greatest kabuki actor or what have you. And then Tamaki ends up marrying, the Mongolian bandit, who then goes back to Mongolia, and she's like, I will also become a Mongolian bandit then to chase after you. It's insane.
I love that. She's like, I'm off to be a bandit princess. I'm like, go, girl.
Make it all happen. It's it's a maelstrom of things that happen, and like your emotions are going from here to here, and people are going from everything's in fifth gear the whole time. And that's the nature of the movie. That's the nature of the Taisho period. And I don't think it hit very well with, either of you fully, because especially the way the ending was, you're kind of logically, looking at it 40 years, 50 years later, you're like, you made the wrong pick, woman.
The body isn't even cold of his previous love, and like.
Well, I mean, they weren't actually. He wasn't actually her husband,
right? But I mean, it was so.
How much of
I don't know.
And she did tell him, like, you should go, you should be happy. So,
and he was faithful to her thing is more to the end. But, you know, still death to you part.
I understand.
Okay, death parted. Let's get out of here.
Get out of here and find someone else right away.
It was not the Newt Gingrich style. She's dying, and I'm going, because he regains his memory while she's still alive, and he's like, but I can't leave her because of all she's done for me. If he was truly an asshole, he would have Newt Gingrich'd her and been like, see ya.
Right, and also she's sick. He's not like, I'm not going to just ditch
that's the
her.
Newt Gingrich part of serving your wife divorce papers as she's on her deathbed to go with someone else.
I think I understand kind of what they were going for with the whole, like, I almost died and, like, I thought I had moved on. It does make Benio seem like kind of a bitch.
Kind of like, what the fuck? But
like she falls in love with the last person who talks to her.
Well, that's the accelerated
She's
timeline,
the OG reverse harem. Before there was even harem, there was the reverse harem, and Benio was at the center of it. And so, you know, without this, there would be no Fushigi Yugi.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that the thing with love triangles, and this isn't quite a love triangle in the normal sense, but it's sort of like tangentially one because of what happens with like Shinobu coming back and everything.
It's kind of like the Kodacha style, like a much more complicated diagram.
Yeah. The risk that you always run, right, with the love triangle is that the author usually has their plan for who's gonna win, who's gonna be like the final love interest. But the risk you always run is that everybody's going to decide that they like the other dude more.
Whether it's, do you want to marry the vampire or the werewolf? Or whether it's, you know, which one does Tenchi...
Well, in that case, they're both shitty.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, team, Edward and Team Jacob, you know, and then, you know, in Tenchi Muyo, they were like, he can't commit to any one of them because it'll make him mad. And so the ultimate solution was he married all of them, including Ryo-Oki, who turned into a woman, and then he married her. That's literally what happened in Tenchi Muyo, to not make anybody mad.
Yeah, and so for me, it was like, that was kind of the thing is like, I think Chief's more interesting, and I like Chief more than Shinobu. So it was like, I kind of was like, okay, that makes me kind of disappointed that like, I knew that was probably what was going to happen, that she was going to end up back with him somehow. But like, they got so close that I was like, maybe she's actually going to do the opposite of what we thought.
Yeah, like pick Tosei. Tosei's the Chief's name, by the way. We always call him Chief because she always just calls him Chief. But she always just calls Shinobu, she always just calls him Lieutenant.
Yeah.
I think obviously the best choice was Tamaki, but this ain't that sort of show.
The thing is, they toned that back. Because I showed you the first episode because they showed like...
Yeah, Tamaki is her female friend from school.
Her female friend from school. And in the first episode, there was like, in the 1978, they were leaning in like super hard of like, hey, we don't need no man. We'll do this together, you know, with each other.
Yes.
She was like, I'm so into her. I'm so in love with her. If I weren't a girl, I would like
if only we weren't both girls, you know. And then there's like the shots from the manga of them like sort of like passionately like, you know, gazing at each other. But remember,
this ain't that sort of show.
It's an S-class relationship.
Right.
That's just practice for when you get married to a quote real relationship, Gerald. So, you know, that's why they get away with that kind of stuff, because at the time,
see, I would have been okay with it. See, I would have felt better about it if like, I feel like, you know, then they should have had like, Chief should have like hooked up with Ranmaru because both of them got screwed.
Well, the Chief had an arranged marriage.
And both of them deserved better.
Ranmaru got the worst.
He got the worst because he didn't get anybody. There was a moment where Tamaki seemed like, you know, her and Ranmaru would be ending up together. But I guess the readership polls said otherwise. They said, no. Tamaki needs to be with Ushiguro because that guy is more handsome. And that's just the rationale.
Don't ask me how I have familiarity with this, but I feel like anyone listening who has experience with traditional romance novels, and I mean like romance novels with painted covers, this is going to be like storyline A in a romance novel.
And that's what I mean, is it's like an older
It's an older approach, you know, that has been done and done and done in the aftermath,
I was able to predict like virtually the entire show because I have like weirdly got familiarity with those storylines.
Sure.
If you have familiarity with that, you know exactly what's going to happen.
And that's why I was kind of excited because like they got like so close that they were like in the wedding. It was like, is she actually going to do something really revolutionary?
Of course not.
No.
No.
The revolutionary aspect of this was revolutionary for 1975, manga for young girls who are, 9 years old. It was revolutionary, romance story written by a woman as opposed to a guy. Like, that's sort of the revolution of the time.
Right. And like Benio does still, like, she is still a career woman and everything. So yeah, there's definitely.
So yeah, that is sort of the challenge of the fact that, hey, what was groundbreaking for 40 years ago is now considered standard or even passé.
Old-fashioned. This is actually super old-fashioned.
Yeah.
We were talking about this in the introduction. Well, like a perfect example of that is something like Mobile Suit Gundam. Especially those movies where like the groundbreaking development of like, hey, they're not all necessarily going to be like Combattler style show. They can go this direction. Well, nowadays, Gundam is this institution that, like, okay, everyone sort of knows what those beats are. And if you watch something like Al Noah Zero with the background of that, you can predict here's everything that's going to happen in this cartoon because I've seen Gundam.
Yeah. Or even like Voltus, where it's like at that point, like having a bad guy that's like
not completely evil,
like sympathetic.
Yeah,
like sympathetic to the audience, who's like attractive, and it's like
nowadays,
now that's,
is
cliche.
Goes with the territory. But back then, there was like a big movement to make that happen. And so a lot of the groundbreaking things that happened in things like Haikara-san and Candy Candy and things of that era, you can't really even see what the advancement was because we're looking at it through the lens of practically half a century later. I mean, the Showa 24 group stuff that focused more on fluidity of gender and sexuality, we can more readily recognize that as groundbreaking today because it still hasn't become convention even now. The only evidence that we really have is the fact that it is this ongoing, eternal, like evergreen. That's sort of like, okay, that's why people look back on this and why people still want to go back and remake it and things like that. The fact that it got released here was obviously taking a big chance because no one here has ever, we have no nostalgia for this at all. And you never even saw it really fan subbed.
And the thing is how do you sell this? Because this is something that would appeal to a middle-aged woman. This is a middle-aged woman's romance because they would be familiar with stories like this. Like, young girls aren't watching romance like this. They're watching supernatural romances and stuff. This is like virtually no audience for this.
These are very enjoyable, entertaining movies. They look good. They sound good. They're funny. They're entertaining. I own the first Blu-ray. I would gladly buy the second one if it were available to me.
Yeah, I think you just have to keep in mind that, like, this is when this came out, and so that's the context. But I like the characters. The thing about the Rosa Versailles and the Showa 24 group stuff is people look at that and say, oh, there's like a direct throughput line from this to Utena, which was very influential on me as a child, or Sailor Moon, which was very influential on me as a child. Haikara-san, like if you hear from the creators of Sailor Moon and things like that, they'll say, yeah, this is one of my favorite things growing up. Like this was formative of me. But you can't look at the work directly and say, this is the clear inspiration for this. It's only after the fact you can be like, okay, there's elements of Benio that I see in Usagi from Sailor Moon. Right. Well, and definitely like the initial, meeting between Usagi and Mamoru is like so similar.
Right.
Yeah.
To
like,
this.
The
how Shinobu meets Benio in this. Very, very similar to that. And you can see, Naoka Takeuchi is like 9 years old, 10 years old, reading stuff like this and Candy Candy and loving it and then incorporating aspects of the things that she liked about this into her own work. You can see it sort of after the fact, but it's not crystal clear obvious. even if you look at the original manga artwork, which again, the character designs for this are drastically different because they modernized them to be more in line with what people would expect a current anime to look like. Again, it doesn't look like it's from an old show, but it's just set in the 1900s.
Yeah, other than those couple of character designs.
Just one or two where it's like you realize, okay, this is the case. But by and large, if you were to look at Benio, she looks like a typical anime lead now. Same thing with Shinobu. Like you could look at how, like, say, I don't know, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, Do No Say, like you look at how they redesigned Reinhard to kind of be like kind of that Kuroko's basketball style. That's kind of what Shinobu looks like in this. Recent, modern trends type stuff.
There's a Lily Hoshino manga that I don't remember if it got animated, but like I feel like the dude character in that is exactly like Shinobu from this.
The legacy of this is something. I mean, apparently the international title of it, if you go to Nippon Animation's English page, is Smart-san. So not even Miss Smart, like they wouldn't, they didn't like conceal that it was in Japan. Like even like when it aired in Russia and they changed all the names, like, you know, like Marc and Marie, like, or Mademoiselle Anne.
Interesting.
They released this, they just changed the names and they basically kept the story more or less the same. And yeah, the rest of the world has known about this. And it continues to sell, it continues to be a thing. That's why they justified making this anime. It wasn't like there's some big Haikara-san patchy slot, you know, thing. You're not getting like the big pachinko money out of, maybe they are, I don't know, but
maybe that's their plot. They got to figure out how to get the housewives into the pachinko parlors.
Because yeah, to Gerald's point, if you didn't have like some sort of memory of this as a thing from back in the day, you know, how are you going to say like, I'm going to watch this new one? What 11 Arts tried to focus on was like the fish out of water aspect, the tomboy aspect of like she's beating people up with an umbrella or a kendo stick and she doesn't know how to use a fork and knife properly, or, you know, like she's breaking the dishes. Like that's the kind of stuff they focused on there. But for this thing to even stand a chance at anyone discovering it, I really feel like it's got to be both parts streaming included as part of some membership you've already got, because everyone always forgets Tubi exists.
Yeah.
Like I would love to say like, hey, if you had Amazon Prime, you could get both parts free of charge.
It's interesting though, because like period pieces are so popular in romance. And so I feel like there's a way they could probably market it. I mean, definitely the story beats are a little still like old fashioned, but I feel like period pieces, and especially since it is a period piece, I think that gives it a certain amount of like, you'd expect the characters to act differently than modern people because it's a period piece. And so I feel like there's a way they could market like a period romance to people.
Right. I think people like when they think about that, they want like everyone to be very reserved, very Jane Austen or very like Downton Abbey or, you know, upstairs, downstairs, whatever the hell.
I mean, Regency is definitely the most popular for period romances.
I just really wish that at some point there was a physical release of part 2. It's been years now and it hasn't happened. I know 11 Arts paired with Right Stuff for some things and then Shout Factory for some others. Part 1 was a Right Stuff thing. I think the reason there's no physical release is because they didn't have the money to dub it. They dubbed part 1, but not part 2, because they were like, we didn't even make enough money to make back the cost of dubbing this thing.
But this is Ranmaru, the boy who lives next door to us.
A boy? Wait, then Benio must be—
Right, genius. That would be me.
Yeah.
Probably the main reason why there's no home video release, but I enjoyed it. I would like to see more things from this era just get released. There's so many things we don't know about. So many things that affected people like way more than we would expect. So many things, even to this day, when you think like, oh, what's left to be released? Oh, we've got all the things on the list. Yeah, but what about the things you don't know about that were good?
Right.
Just not like over here in our language. That's like the next frontier.
Well, like when we had Helen on and we were talking about OK Namansho, like
exactly.
That's another like huge shoujo series. That series is still going. It started in the 70s. It is still running.
And nobody here knows about it because there's no current anime release. There's no like prestige release of the manga or even like digital only or something like that. But yeah, I really feel like for a long time, like the gap was what we'd call now classic anime. Now there's things that are international classics that just weren't known in the United States. And that's the part that we really know very little about still. And it's going to be hard because even if Saint Seiya can't catch on, even if it gets the re-releases here and stuff like that, what chances do these other things have? Like Captain Tsubasa, we've gotten Captain Tsubasa and Saint Seiya video games and stuff like that in the United States, and everyone just looks at it confused and it's like, what the hell is this? You know, even re-releasing the anime wouldn't help people because it'd be like, this thing's from 35 years ago. What the hell is this?
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to overcome.
I guess there was an Okinamancho OAV from Toei, so maybe somebody could get that. I don't know.
And I'm not going to lie, I didn't really care for this at all.
Another one in the trend of I show someone a movie and it's always Gerald who like hates the movie.
Yeah.
Because Makio is also 11 Arts, right? You fucking hated that one. That's also a melodrama and you thought that shit sucked. Is there actually any melodrama?
I thought you loved 70s shoujo melodrama,
does
Gerald.
he? Does he like any melodrama? I don't think so.
I like Brother Dear Brother a ton.
I guess that is one. Yeah,
that's
from the
super melodrama.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think there's a way to market it, but like I think you have to target that like romance audience.
And it can't be like the new romance audience. It has to be like people who have been reading romance for 30 years.
I think if you like lean on the fact that it's a period piece, because that's going to come with, like I said, some expectations of people are going to act differently than they would a modern person. I think they could help contextualize it that way.
That's probably the best chance, but it's a long shot.
But that romance audience is like a totally different group of people from the people that are probably going to know about an anime movie.
Oh, yeah.
Coming out. So like you have to get somebody that's going to market it to a totally different group of people.
Yeah, like the audience that this is really like ideal for is again like women in their 50s and 60s, familiar with these very, very tried and trodden over romance tropes.
And how many of them will watch a damn cartoon?
Exactly. They have never seen a romance animated thing in their life, probably.
But yeah, I'm glad it got made. I'm glad it exists. Obviously, I'm outnumbered on this regard, but so be it.
No, I like it. I mean, I have criticisms of it.
I also have criticisms of it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like, unassailable or anything, but
it's a lot of fun.
And yeah, I think it's enjoyable and fun. And I think Furuhashi, he's got a bunch of other works that I feel that people should probably go back and check out. I feel the Taisho era in general deserves like some more coverage. But again, it's just there's so much violence and fighting and stuff that went on right before and right after that it's kind of like one of those things where even something like Taisho Baseball Girls or Sakura Wars or things like that, those are not mega super duper hits here. Even Sakura Wars, which came out here,
it's got a small audience,
following that's dedicated to it because of stuff from 30 years ago almost. The only thing you'd ever seen of Sakura Wars with no familiarity of it otherwise was the new one. That's a hard sell. Because it's treading on a sort of assumed sort of partial familiarity with the original premise and source material. And granted, the new one is not in Taisho era anymore because they ran out of time. So they went on full alternate history at this point. I mean, it was only partially alternate history with the robots, right? But and the demons. But yeah, I just wish that there was some way to crack that. This was a valiant effort at it. And I think if more people had seen it or was willing to at least check it out, it's just hard to market. Because what do you say? From the director of Rurouni Kenshin? That doesn't work. From the man who brought you Gundam Unicorn.
From the romance that your mom reads. What?
If you loved Neo Yokio, no, it doesn't. I guarantee you, people are going to be gun shy on it from the future. I mean, what do you say? Like, if it was with CPM, because what they would always do would be like put like some completely unrelated thing on there, right?
From the character designer of something.
Well, in this case, the character designer, and this is Terumi Nishi, and people know who she is, but they would say from the character designer of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And then the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure people come in and they're like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, they used to put from the character designer of City Hunter before City Hunter was released here. Like,
yeah.
I'm glad I watched it. Like I said, I didn't like it at all, but I'm glad I watched it.
Didn't like it at all. It's getting more and more progressively severe as time goes on. Now it's like you didn't like the ending, you didn't like that. Now I didn't like it at all.
I wasn't a fan of it, but I'm glad that I watched it. It's absolutely not for me. It is a straight, old-fashioned romance. But I don't expect it to appeal to me because of that.
I mean, I also hate romance, but to me it came off as a comedy with some romance and drama than a romance with some jokes. And that's the reason, though, why I think Waki Yamato and those things, they haven't really gotten as much recognition here, is because they made traditional romance things. And the Show 24 group, like whether it's Dear Brother or Rose of Versailles or something like that, those aren't fully romance. They have elements of romance in them, but it's not primarily that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look how long it took for girls to start being recognized as like an audience for manga and anime stuff over here. Right? You know,
in America, it took ridiculously long. It's stupid. There was stuff being made for girls in the 20s in Japan. AKA
the Taisho era, AKA things like Haikara-san, Here Comes Miss Modern. Don't watch it because it's a classic or it's influential. Watch it because it's entertaining now.